They mock the quiet lady sitting in seat 16C. Fellow passengers laugh at her knowledge about military planes. They think she's just another ordinary traveler who reads too much. Then Air Force fighter jets appear outside the window, requesting permission to salute the legendary war hero among them. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe, like and share. Flight 447 from Denver to Washington, D.C. was packed with the usual mix of Tuesday morning travelers. Business people clutched their laptops and phones, making last-minute calls before takeoff. Families struggled with carry-on bags while trying to keep children entertained. Flight attendants moved efficiently through the aisles, helping passengers find overhead space and settle into their seats. In seat 16C by the window, sat a woman who looked completely unremarkable. Sarah Mitchell appeared to be in her mid-40s, with brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore a dark navy blazer over a white blouse, small gold earrings and reading glasses that she adjusted occasionally as she reviewed a stack of papers. Her movements were economical and precise. She didn't fidget, didn't seem nervous about flying, and didn't try to make small talk with the passengers around her. To everyone who glanced her way, she looked like what most people would expect from a middle-aged woman traveling alone. Probably a teacher heading to an education conference, maybe an accountant going to a business meeting, or perhaps a government worker attending some routine seminar in the nation's capital. Nothing about her appearance suggested anything extraordinary. In seat 16A sat Brad Coleman, a pharmaceutical sales representative who had spent the morning bragging to anyone who would listen about closing a major deal with a Denver hospital system. He wore an expensive charcoal gray suit, gold cufflinks, and a watch that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Brad was the type of person who assumed his success in sales made him an expert on everything else, and he wasn't shy about sharing his opinions. The middle seat 16B remained empty, a small mercy that gave both Brad and Sarah a little extra space. Behind them in row 17 sat Jim Peterson and Kevin Walsh, both defense contractors who worked for a company that developed communication systems for military aircraft. They had been discussing their upcoming presentation to Pentagon officials, speaking loudly enough that half the cabin could hear their conversation about classified contracts and high-level meetings. Across the aisle from Sarah, in seat 16F, sat Margaret Chin, a middle-aged woman who worked in human resources for a large corporation. She had been traveling to Washington, D.C. for a diversity and inclusion conference, and like many passengers, she had formed quick impressions about her fellow travelers based on their appearance and the snippets of conversation she had overheard. As the plane finished boarding and the flight attendants prepared for departure, Brad decided to strike up a conversation with his quiet seatmate. He had learned from years in sales that flights were perfect opportunities to network and make new business connections. Business or pleasure? Brad asked Sarah with his practiced sales smile, the kind of opening line that had worked for him countless times in airport lounges and hotel bars. Sarah looked up from her papers, removing her reading glasses and giving him a polite smile. Business, she replied simply, then returned her attention to the documents in her lap. Brad wasn't deterred by her brevity. In his experience, quiet passengers usually just needed a little encouragement to open up. Let me guess, he continued, leaning slightly across the empty middle seat. You're probably in education, right? Maybe heading to one of those teacher conferences they're always having in D.C.? Or wait, I bet you're in human resources. That would explain the professional look in all those papers. Sarah glanced up again, this time with a slightly amused expression. What makes you think I'm in education or HR? Just a hunch, Brad said with confidence. I've been traveling for business for 15 years and you learn to read people. Most women flying alone to D.C. are either teachers, government workers, or in some kind of administrative role. No offense, those are important jobs. I'm just good at picking up on these things. Behind them, Jim Peterson had been half listening to the conversation while reviewing his own presentation materials. He turned around with a friendly grin. Did someone say they're heading to D.C. for work? My partner Kevin and I are presenting some new technology to the Pentagon tomorrow. Always interesting to meet fellow business travelers. Kevin Walsh looked up from his laptop. What kind of work brings you to Washington? He asked Sarah directly. I'm attending a ceremony at the Air Force Memorial, Sarah replied, folding her papers neatly and placing them in a leather portfolio. This sparked immediate interest from the men around her. Jim's eyebrows rose with curiosity. Oh really? That's fascinating. Are you writing an article about military affairs? Or maybe you're part of some veterans advocacy group? Actually, Sarah said calmly, I'm just attending the ceremony. Margaret Chin had been listening from across the aisle, and she leaned over slightly to join the conversation. That's wonderful that you're taking an interest in military affairs. So many civilians don't really understand or appreciate what our servicemen go through. It's nice to see someone making the effort to learn. The way she emphasized servicemen wasn't lost on Sarah, but she simply nodded politely. It should be an interesting event. Kevin assumed his most knowledgeable tone. You know, my company has contracts with several branches of the military. We work closely with Air Force personnel on communication systems. The technology these days is incredible, nothing like what most people imagine when they think about military operations. I'm sure it's quite advanced, Sarah agreed. Brad sensed an opportunity to showcase his own military connections. My brother-in-law is actually in the Air Force, Captain Mark Coleman, stationed out at Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado Springs. He tells me stories about the training these pilots go through. It's absolutely incredible what they have to master. The training is definitely intensive, Sarah said quietly. As the flight continued, the conversation gradually became more technical as the men began sharing what they knew about military aircraft and aviation procedures. Unfortunately, several of the facts being discussed were completely incorrect, and Sarah found herself listening to increasingly inaccurate information. Those F-22 Raptors are absolutely incredible, Brad was saying with complete confidence. My brother-in-law told me they can easily reach speeds of Mach 3, making them the fastest fighters ever built. And the stealth technology is so advanced that they're literally invisible to enemy radar. Kevin nodded in agreement. The avionics systems are beyond anything in civilian aviation. These planes practically fly themselves in combat situations. The pilot is almost just along for the ride. Sarah cleared her throat softly. Actually, the F-22's maximum speed is approximately Mach 2.25. The fastest operational fighter aircraft is generally considered to be the MiG-25 Foxbat, which could reach speeds over Mach 3.2, though that was at the cost of significant engine damage. The group turned to look at her with surprise and mild amusement. Here was their quiet fellow passenger, supposedly a travel agent or flight attendant, correcting them on technical military specifications. Jim smiled condescendingly. Well, I'm sure you read that somewhere online, but the actual combat specifications are often quite different from what gets published in magazines or websites. The real performance data is usually classified at much higher levels. That's true, Sarah agreed calmly. Much of the detailed performance data does remain classified. But the general specifications I mentioned are from publicly available sources, including official Air Force publications and congressional testimony. Brad chuckled with obvious amusement. You seem to know a lot about military aircraft for someone in the travel industry. Been watching a lot of Discovery Channel documentaries on military technology? Also, Sarah continued, ignoring the condescending tone, regarding that rescue mission you were discussing earlier, Operation Mountain Eagle, success wasn't just about brave flying. It required precise coordination between multiple aircraft types, real-time intelligence from satellite reconnaissance, and coordination with ground teams. The pilots had to execute a complex tactical insertion pattern while maintaining radio silence for most of the approach to avoid enemy detection systems. Kevin laughed outright now. Okay, Miss Military Expert. Let me guess, you've been reading Tom Clancy novels and now you think you understand special operations? Real combat aviation is about split-second decisions and pure instinct, not following some textbook procedure. Several passengers around them were now listening to the exchange, some smiling at what appeared to be a civilian trying to sound knowledgeable about military matters she couldn't possibly understand from personal experience. Margaret shook her head with amusement. It's funny how people think they understand military operations from watching movies or reading books. Real combat aviation is nothing like what you see on television screens or in Hollywood films. Sarah looked directly at Margaret and said quietly, "You're absolutely right. It's nothing like what you see in movies." As the flight continued, the passengers around Sarah seemed increasingly determined to test her claimed knowledge, and to prove that she was just another civilian who had read too many military novels or watched too many documentaries. "Since you seem to know so much about military aircraft operations," Kevin said with obvious sarcasm dripping from his voice, "maybe you can enlighten us about the real challenges of flying in formation during actual combat situations? Not the theoretical stuff you read about, but the actual reality." Sarah considered whether to respond, then decided to answer honestly. Formation flying in combat requires constant communication and absolute trust between pilots. Each aircraft maintains specific positioning based on mission requirements, weather conditions, threat assessment, and the current tactical situation. The lead pilot makes split-second decisions that everyone else must follow instantly, without question or hesitation. She's got the textbook answers memorized, Jim said to the others with a dismissive wave. But any actual military pilot will tell you it's much more about instinct and experience than following written procedures. You can't learn that kind of thing from books or documentaries. You're exactly right, Sarah agreed without any defensiveness. Training and procedures create the foundation, but in real combat situations, you rely on experience, instinct, and the trust you've built with your fellow pilots over time. You learn to read your wingman's movements, anticipate their actions before they make them, and react faster than conscious thought allows. Brad rolled his eyes dramatically. Okay, now you're just making stuff up to sound impressive. How would you possibly know what it feels like to fly in combat formation? Have you ever even been inside a military aircraft, much less flown one in a combat situation? No, Sarah replied simply and honestly. I wouldn't presume to know what that feels like. The passengers exchanged knowing looks and satisfied smiles. They had caught her in her pretense, forced her to admit that all her detailed knowledge was purely theoretical and had no basis in actual experience. Kevin decided to press the point further, wanting to make sure the lesson was complete. Look, lady, it's obvious you've read extensively about military aviation, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with having interests and hobbies. But you're talking to people who actually work with the military on a professional basis. We know real pilots, real combat veterans, and they don't appreciate civilians who pretend to have insider knowledge about things they've never actually experienced firsthand. The elderly gentleman in the row behind them, George Patterson, tried to soften the criticism while still making his point clear. I'm sure you find military history fascinating, dear. Many people do, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that kind of intellectual curiosity. But there's a significant difference between academic knowledge and lived experience. Between reading about something in books and actually doing it under life-or-death conditions. You're absolutely right, Sarah said graciously, accepting the gentle correction with dignity. There is a tremendous difference between reading about something and actually experiencing it firsthand. About 2 hours into the flight, Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom with an announcement that would completely change everything for the passengers of Flight 447. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're currently encountering some severe weather patterns ahead of our planned flight path. Air traffic control is working with military aircraft operating in the region to coordinate our safe passage around this storm system. We may experience some delays as we navigate around the weather conditions, but I want to assure you that safety remains our absolute top priority. Please remain seated with your seatbelts securely fastened. The passengers looked around with mild concern but no real alarm. Weather delays were common enough, but coordination with military aircraft suggested something more complex than a simple route change around thunderstorms. Several minutes later, Captain Rodriguez's voice returned with an update that immediately heightened everyone's attention throughout the cabin. Folks, I want to provide you with an update on our current situation. We are now being escorted by United States Air Force fighter aircraft as we navigate around a temporary restricted airspace area. This is purely precautionary, and I want to emphasize that there is no cause for alarm. The military pilots are ensuring our safe passage through the region. Through her window, Sarah could see the distinctive silhouette of F-16 Fighting Falcons maintaining precise formation alongside their commercial airliner. She immediately recognized the aircraft type, could assess the professional quality of their formation flying, and could mentally picture the complex communication protocols being used between the military and civilian pilots to coordinate this unusual escort mission. The sight of the fighter escort created an immediate buzz of excitement and nervous energy throughout the cabin. Passengers pressed against windows to get better views of the military aircraft, cell phones came out to take pictures despite flight regulations, and animated conversations erupted about what might be happening to require such an unusual escort. This is absolutely incredible, Brad said, craning his neck to see the fighters through the small aircraft window. I've never seen anything like this on a commercial flight. This has got to be some kind of serious security situation. Kevin was already on his phone trying to take photos through the small window. My colleagues back at the office are never going to believe this. Military escort for a civilian airliner? This has to be either a security threat or some kind of VIP protection detail. Or maybe it's just a complex training exercise, Jim suggested, though his voice carried uncertainty. Sometimes the military coordinates with civilian flights for practice scenarios, but usually they announce that kind of thing in advance. Margaret looked genuinely nervous now. I really hope everything is okay. You don't usually see fighter jets escorting passenger planes unless something serious is happening. I've never experienced anything like this. In the cockpit of Flight 447, Captain Rodriguez was maintaining professional communication with air traffic control and the military flight leader when something completely unexpected occurred. The Air Force flight commander made an unusual request for specific information about the passenger manifest, specifically asking if anyone named Sarah Mitchell was aboard the aircraft. Denver Center, this is United 447, Captain Rodriguez responded according to standard protocol. Confirming request for passenger information. May I ask the nature of this inquiry for our records? United 447, this is Viper flight leader. We need to verify if you have Colonel Sarah Mitchell aboard your aircraft. Please confirm passenger in seat 16C. Captain Rodriguez was puzzled but followed proper security protocol. He asked his senior flight attendant to discreetly verify the full name of the passenger in seat 16C without alarming other travelers or creating any kind of disturbance in the cabin. Lisa approached Sarah with professional discretion. Excuse me, ma'am, but the captain needs to confirm your full name for air traffic control coordination purposes. It's just a routine security verification check. Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, she replied calmly, though a small part of her suspected what might be happening based on her years of experience with military protocols. Lisa returned to the cockpit and relayed this information to Captain Rodriguez, who immediately passed it along to the military flight leader through the appropriate communication channels. The response from the fighter escort was immediate and filled with unmistakable respect and awe that was obvious even through the professional military communication protocols. United 447, be advised you have Colonel Sarah Phoenix Mitchell aboard your aircraft. She is one of the most highly decorated combat pilots in United States Air Force history. We respectfully request permission to render full military honors. In the cockpit, Captain Rodriguez and his co-pilot exchanged amazed glances. They had both heard of Phoenix. Every pilot, military or civilian, had heard whispered stories about the legendary call sign. The name belonged to someone who had become almost mythical in aviation circles. A pilot who had led the most dangerous rescue missions, saved hundreds of lives and earned legendary status throughout the entire military aviation community. Viper flight leader, this is United 447, Captain Rodriguez responded, his voice now carrying newfound respect and wonder. Permission granted for military honors. Please advise the nature of honors for passenger notification purposes. United 447, we are requesting to execute a ceremonial formation flyby with full military honors. Colonel Mitchell personally led the rescue mission that saved our squadron commander's life during Operation Desert Storm. It would be the highest honor for our flight to pay our respects to Phoenix. Captain Rodriguez switched to the passenger announcement system, and when he spoke this time, his voice carried a gravity and profound respect that immediately commanded the attention of every person throughout the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I have just learned that we have a very distinguished and highly honored passenger aboard our flight today. The United States Air Force pilots who are currently escorting our aircraft have requested permission to render full military honors to Colonel Sarah Mitchell, call sign Phoenix, who is seated in 16C. The effect throughout the cabin was immediate and dramatic. Every single conversation stopped instantly. Every passenger turned to stare at the quiet woman by the window who had been dismissed and mocked throughout the flight. Captain Rodriguez continued, his voice filled with genuine awe and respect. Colonel Mitchell is one of the most highly decorated combat pilots in United States Air Force history. She has led numerous classified rescue operations and is credited with saving hundreds of lives during her distinguished military career. The fighter aircraft alongside us have requested to perform a ceremonial flyby in recognition of her extraordinary service to our nation. Brad's whiskey glass stopped halfway to his mouth, frozen in midair as he stared at Sarah in complete shock and disbelief. Kevin and Jim looked at each other and then at Sarah, their expressions showing the dawning realization of how completely and utterly wrong they had been about everything. Margaret covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with embarrassment and amazement. George, the elderly gentleman who had called her dear, and gently corrected her presumed ignorance, appeared to be in complete shock. The entire cabin had fallen into stunned, absolute silence as passengers processed what they had just learned. The quiet, unassuming woman they had dismissed as a travel agent or flight attendant was actually a legendary military hero whose name was known and revered throughout the aviation world. Outside the aircraft windows, the F-16 Fighting Falcons moved into precise ceremonial formation with a kind of professional precision that spoke of countless hours of training and experience. The lead pilot's voice came through the cabin speakers as Captain Rodriguez patched the military communication through to the passenger cabin. Colonel Mitchell, this is Major Jake Viper, Thompson, 20th Fighter Wing out of Shaw Air Force Base. Ma'am, it is an incredible honor to be flying escort for you today. You personally led the mission that extracted my squadron commander, Colonel Bradley, during Operation Desert Phoenix in Syria 2 years ago. The entire wing considers it the highest privilege to render honors to you. Sarah reached for the aircraft intercom handset that Lisa quickly provided, her movements still economical and precise. When she spoke, her voice carried the unmistakable authority and confidence of someone who had commanded respect in the most dangerous situations imaginable. Thank you, Major Thompson. It's good to hear from the 20th Fighter Wing. How is Colonel Bradley recovering from his injuries? Fully recovered and back to active duty, ma'am. He specifically asked me to send his personal regards and to tell you that the first round of drinks at the officers' club is on him whenever you're back at Shaw. Several passengers audibly gasped. Shaw Air Force Base was home to some of the most elite fighter pilots in the world. The casual familiarity between Sarah and these military aviators spoke of relationships forged in combat and mutual respect earned under the most extreme conditions possible. Please give Colonel Bradley my regards, Sarah replied. And tell him I'm glad to hear he's back in the cockpit where he belongs. Will do, ma'am. Colonel Mitchell, we're requesting permission to execute a 4-ship ceremonial flyby in your honor. Permission granted, Major. And Major Thompson? Yes, ma'am? That's beautiful formation flying you're demonstrating today. Tell your pilots they're maintaining excellent positioning in these crosswinds. Thank you, ma'am. Coming from Phoenix, that means more than you could possibly know. The Air Force formation executed a flawless ceremonial flyby that took the breath away from every single passenger aboard Flight 447. The 4 F-16 Fighting Falcons moved with ballet-like precision, performing the traditional military aerial salute reserved for only the most distinguished service members. From inside the commercial airliner, passengers watched in absolute awe as some of the most advanced fighter jets in the world paid tribute to the woman who had been sitting quietly among them, enduring their mockery and dismissive comments with grace and dignity. Brad Coleman, who had been so confident about his military knowledge and connections, sat completely speechless. His expensive suit, his pharmaceutical contracts, his boasts about his brother-in-law in the Air Force, everything suddenly seemed incredibly small and insignificant compared to the woman he had patronized and dismissed. Kevin and Jim, the defense contractors who had questioned Sarah's understanding of military operations and suggested she learned everything from movies, realized they had been lecturing one of the most experienced and respected combat pilots in the history of military aviation. Their company's contracts probably existed because of missions that Sarah had planned, led, or inspired. Margaret, who had suggested that Sarah might be a flight attendant and had made condescending assumptions about women in aviation, looked like she wanted to disappear into her seat. Her comments about civilians not understanding military service now seemed incredibly ironic and embarrassing. As the F-16s peeled away in perfect formation to resume their regular duties, the cabin of Flight 447 remained in complete, stunned silence. Every passenger was processing what they had just witnessed, not just the extraordinary aerial display, but the profound realization of who had been traveling among them. Lisa approached Sarah with obvious reverence, her entire manner transformed by the revelation of who she had been serving. Colonel Mitchell, is there anything at all we can do to make the remainder of your flight more comfortable? We had absolutely no idea of your service record. The entire crew wants to express our deepest gratitude for your service. Sarah looked up with the same gentle, humble smile she had maintained throughout all the mockery and dismissive comments. I'm fine, thank you. And please, I'm retired from active duty. Just Sarah is perfectly fine. But the word Colonel had already spread throughout the entire cabin like wildfire. Flight attendants whispered the story to each other and to passengers in other sections. People in seats throughout the plane turned to catch glimpses of the legendary pilot who had been sitting anonymously among them. Brad finally found the courage to speak, his voice barely above a whisper and filled with genuine shame. Ma'am, Colonel, I owe you a profound apology. We all do. We had absolutely no idea who you were, and we treated you with such disrespect and condescension. Sarah turned to face him with the same calm, patient expression she had maintained throughout his earlier condescension. You have nothing to apologize for, Brad. I chose not to identify myself or my background. You were just making conversation like any other passenger would do. But we were so dismissive and arrogant, Kevin said, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. We questioned your knowledge, suggested you didn't know what you were talking about, and implied that you were just some civilian who had read too many books or watched too many movies. Did I give you any specific reason to think otherwise? Sarah asked gently. I was just another passenger on a flight, sharing in conversation. That's exactly how I wanted it to be. The conversations continued as passengers shared their amazement, embarrassment, and newfound respect. Sarah answered questions about her service with the same quiet dignity, explaining that she had flown special operations missions for 17 years, primarily combat search and rescue operations. When asked about her call sign Phoenix, Sarah's expression grew distant. During a mission in Afghanistan, my aircraft took severe damage while extracting a downed F-15 pilot. We completed the rescue, but our helicopter crashed. The entire team survived and walked 60 miles through enemy territory to reach friendly forces. When we made it back, someone said we had risen from the ashes like a phoenix. The simple way she described what was obviously an extraordinary feat made it sound routine, but everyone understood they were hearing about incredible bravery under impossible circumstances. As the flight began its descent toward Washington, D.C., conversations became more personal. When asked if she missed flying dangerous missions, Sarah replied thoughtfully, "I miss the people I served with most. There's a bond between people who have faced life and death situations together that's difficult to describe. But I don't miss the constant stress or the toll it took on personal relationships." She spoke honestly about being divorced, explaining that military life was extraordinarily difficult on relationships. Living with someone who disappears on classified missions for months, never knowing if they'll come back, isn't something most people can handle long-term. When asked about children, she said simply, "That was one of the choices I made. Special operations deployments are unpredictable and dangerous. I didn't feel it would be fair to bring children into that kind of uncertainty." The honesty and vulnerability in her answers resonated deeply with everyone listening. They were seeing not just a decorated war hero, but a real person who had made profound personal sacrifices for her service. Sarah explained that she was attending a ceremony honoring retired service members who participated in classified operations that could now be publicly acknowledged. "The families of people we rescued who never knew who brought their loved ones home will finally be able to meet us and express their gratitude." The following morning at the Air Force Memorial, Sarah stood with 14 other retired military aviators receiving recognition for their service. Several passengers from Flight 447 attended, having been profoundly affected by their encounter. When Sarah's service record was read aloud, 67 successful rescue missions, over 300 personnel extracted, 0 lost under her command, the audience learned details that had been classified for years. But what impressed the Flight 447 passengers most was her same quiet dignity in accepting recognition, deflecting credit to fellow service members. At the reception afterward, families of rescued personnel met their heroes. A middle-aged woman approached with tears, "You saved my son in Iraq in 2007. Staff Sergeant David Chin. I never knew who brought him home until today." "How is David?" Sarah remembered the mission clearly. Married with children, working as a paramedic. He became one because his rescuer taught him about helping others in emergencies. Similar conversations continued throughout the reception. The Flight 447 passengers watched these interactions with growing understanding that this wasn't just about military achievements, it was about families staying together, about people coming home to their lives. "I understand now that service isn't just a job," Kevin told Sarah afterward. "It's about being willing to risk everything for people you've never met, people who may never know your name." "You demonstrated that real strength doesn't need to announce itself," Brad added. "True heroes don't need recognition." Margaret spoke about learning about her own prejudices, making assumptions based on gender and appearance. Sarah replied firmly, "Don't be ashamed. Use it as learning. We all make assumptions. The important thing is treating people with respect regardless of initial impressions." In the weeks following, the story's impact rippled outward. Brad's nephew Michael contacted Air Force recruiters, inspired by authentic service demonstrated with quiet dignity. Brad began listening more than talking. Kevin and Jim volunteered with veterans organizations. Margaret enrolled in military history courses and volunteered at veterans hospitals. 6 months later, Sarah received a letter from Michael, now preparing for his Air Force commission. "You taught me that true heroism isn't about seeking recognition, it's quiet service, consistent character, and putting others before yourself. You also taught me not to judge by appearances, to treat everyone with respect because you never know who has served or sacrificed." Sarah smiled as she read the letter, placing it with hundreds of others from people touched by military service stories. Each reminded her that service extends beyond individual achievements. True service creates ripples touching lives in ways never fully measured. The woman in seat 16C had traveled planning to attend a quiet ceremony honoring her service. Instead, she participated in a different kind of ceremony, one that honored the dignity of all people, the importance of looking beyond appearances, and the power of quiet heroism to inspire others. As she prepared for future trips, Sarah packed with the same simple efficiency. She would continue traveling in civilian clothes, sitting quietly, treating fellow passengers with courtesy and respect, because that's what real heroes do. They serve with dignity, lead by example, and carry extraordinary achievements with ordinary grace. The legacy of Seat 16C lived on in everyone who learned to look beyond appearances, treat others with respect regardless of first impressions, and understand that heroism comes in many forms, most of them quiet, humble, and completely unannounced. The story became a reminder that extraordinary people walk among us every day, serving with dignity and grace, proving that the most powerful lessons are often taught not through grand speeches but through simply being genuinely good people in a world that desperately needs more of them.